least Eastern. Welcome, everybody. It's now 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and it just so happens all four of us on this panel, along with Vara, we're on 4 separate times. So anyway, it's amazing what Zoom can do. This is the Ethical Quest and Context panel. Leslie Stephen, Woolf's A Society, and the Search Society. So I will introduce the panelists one at a time, and then each will give her presentation. And then I'll go to the next one. And I'm going to provide the links to the presentations in the chat. Right now you have Leslie's presentation, and I've also provided from Leslie a link to a project she wants to tell you about. So let me start. Leslie Kathleen Hankins has been absorbed lately in the book arts, early cinema, and Woolf, and has published several of her own poetic, photographic picture books, as well as eclectic cinematic illustrated editions of Woolf's work through her small Making Waves press. Chair of her department in English and creative writing at Cornell College in Iowa, she has recently been awarded the Norma and Richard Small Distinguished Professorship for 2022 to 2024. More to the point here, she has presented at every one of the Virginia Woolf conferences and is a former president of the International Virginia Woolf Society. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. I'll do share screen. Okay. I'm going to begin. Oh, my title is a Centenary Cinematic Edition of A Society, Woolf's Ethical Comedy of Self-Defense. And I want to begin with a sneak preview of the, oh wait, is it moving without my authority? Oh no. A Centenary Cinematic Edition of A Society, Woolf's Ethical Comedy of Self-Defense. I want
Leslie, sorry, one thing. Can you put your PowerPoint on slideshow? Sorry.
How's that? I'm afraid it's kind of well, we'll see what happens. I want to begin with a sneak preview of the Making Waves Press Centenary Cinematic Edition of Virginia Woolf's A Society, which just arrived from Bookmobile, my printer, a few days ago. The edition is 5 by 7 inches and 234 pages, illustrated throughout with black and white silent film style. And it is half price, $7.50 for the conference. And for each one sold, I'll donate $2 to the International Virginia Woolf Society. I hope Michael Patrick Hart's tantalizing talk whet your appetite for more on A Society. Back to the presentation. One of my favorite pieces of Virginia Woolf's prose is the rough transcript of the draft speech of Professions for Women that she delivered on a platform with Ethel Smythe on January 21st, 1931. In it, her rollicking humor seems to pour forth hilarious, uncensored, full force and free. To me, it harks back to A Society before Woolf got the memo that men couldn't take blunt critique about their privilege. In her 1931 speech, Woolf is beyond fearing a whip and can let it all out. Quote, "There is a villain in the piece. The villain was not, I grieve to say, our old friend man, the other sex, or at least only indirectly. He may have had a finger in it, but the villain of my story was a woman, the angel in the house." I now record the one act for which I take some credit. I turned upon that angel and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. My excuse, if I were to be had up in a law court and charged with murder, would be that I acted in self-defense. If I had not killed her, she would have killed me as a writer, unquote. This concept of self-defense forms the cornerstone of our analysis of A Society and its comedy. When we place the society in context, as Susan Dick and others have done, we see it as Woolf's response to toxic misogyny in a public debate about limits of women's intelligence and creativity. It was a feisty exchange between Virginia Woolf and affable hawk Desmond McCarthy in the New Statesman letters to the editor pages in October 1920 over McCarthy's review supporting Bennett's misogynist book, Our Women. In their exchanges, McCarthy counters Woolf's facts and reasoning with snide asides, faux chivalry, evasive rhetoric, and a snarky exit. Bennett's Our Women pontificates, quote, in creation, in synthesis, in criticism, in pure intellect, women have never approached the accomplishments of men. McCarthy's review quotes Bennett and adds little stingers of his own. Quote, women are inferior to men in intellectual power, especially in that kind of power which is described as creative. Certainly that fact stares one in the face. And he, Bennett, admits that, quote, no amount of education and liberty of action will sensibly alter it, unquote. McCarthy adds that, quote, I cannot conceive anybody who considers facts impartially coming to any other conclusion, unquote. Woolf composed her story as a counterblast against what she termed the adverse views of the males. Her tale is a roller coaster burlesque of male privilege with its unexamined, often to such males, invisible assumptions. A carnivalesque social critique. Bennett and McCarthy's unacknowledged misogyny and dismissive male privilege, Bennett actually claimed to be a feminist, triggered Virginia Woolf's response in a society. How did early critics respond to her story? And suddenly, this is Winifred Holtby, and suddenly it seemed something happened to her spirits. She learned gaiety. The little sketch called A Society is on an entirely new note. Now, in this strange little squib, gaiety dances. It is evanescent with hyperbole. It is debonair with nonsense. Harold Child in the TLS wrote, quote, there is a thread of hearty masculine fun woven in with the shrewd and wicked wit of that very feminine, almost feminist tale, A Society, which brings one to outright laughter, unquote. Woolf's creative and very feminist comedy in A Society is pointed. Affable Hawk could not resist lashing back in his review of Monday or Tuesday in 1921, quote, when, as in A Society, she writes from contempt, her work is not her best, unquote. But A Society is hilarious with what Judy Little terms renegade humor. That could be the humor of the despised and mocked when the oppressor is out of earshot. But what does Desmond find contemptuous in the tale? Mocking misogyny and laughing at male privilege? Rebecca Solnit may help us to process Desmond's somewhat outraged response. Quote, but seriously, you know who can't take a joke? White guys. Not if it implicates them and their universe. And when you see the rage, the pettiness, the meltdowns, and fountains of male tears of fury, you're seeing people who really expected to get their own way and be told they're wonderful all through the days, unquote. And of course, Woolf's A Society does implicate privileged males in their universe, which no doubt explains Desmond's huffiness. The camaraderie of the Bloomsbury group did not, as Desmond McCarthy demonstrates, embrace feminism fully. Woolf became quite aware of how males, even those in her closest circle, judged women. Later, in A Room of One's Own, the narrator asks why the professors were angry and suggests, quote, possibly when the professor insisted a little too emphatically upon the inferiority of women, he was concerned not with their inferiority, but with his own superiority. That was what he was protecting, rather hot-headedly and with too much emphasis, because it was a jewel to him of the rarest price, unquote. So, can privileged men learn to recognize their privilege through corrective comedy? Rebecca Solnit is not very optimistic. Quote, I coined a term a while ago, privil obliviousness, to try to describe the way that being the advantaged one, the represented one, often means being the one who doesn't need to be aware and often isn't, unquote. When someone prods them to become aware, the privil oblivious often don't take censure or wit or argument or attack well. Women often learn it's smarter and safer to save laughter and comedy about men for rooms of our own, or to use the modern equivalent of Virginia Woolf's tea table manners around them. But of course, it depends on your goal. Is it to educate the reluctant privileged? Tea table manners may at least evade retaliation, though they may invite dismissal and disdain. And one might ask, is it ethical to placate the privileged? What about the ethical integrity of being your own true voice, unapologetic and fiercely real? It can be wildly refreshing to preach to the choir of other feminists and forget about the egos of the privileged. The alternative has too often been silencing ourselves. Virginia Woolf and the comic. Taking all this into consideration, I argue for the resurrection of Woolf's outrageous humor, for the ethics of comedy as self-defense. No longer reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size, we might turn funhouse mirrors on male privil obliviousness, pulling the rug out from under male privilege and misogyny by laughing at the emperor with no jokes to cover his privilege. As the Guerrilla Girls demonstrate in their feminist art activism, comic intervention can disrupt male privilege. Engaging with the ethics of comedy, I composed the Centenary cinematic edition of A Society launched here, relishing Woolf's complex and delightful comic strategies in the story and drawing on them to edit and illustrate the edition. To design the illustrations, I chose as homage images from film comedians such as Mabel Normand and Elsa Lancaster, and feminist filmmakers of the day, Germaine Dulac, Lois Weber, and Alice Guy Blanchet. Positive images of gender switching, same-sex attraction, and cross-dressing are taken from fantasy sections of the quirky cult classic of Florida Enchantment. In addition, some visuals of Rose, Fanny, and Elizabeth cross-dressing are taken from photo cards of the amazing music hall superstar, Vesta Tilley, who used her male impersonation skits to laugh at some masculine behavior. Images of the iconic British star, Ivor Novello, were used as stand-ins for the iconic privileged male. Throughout A Society, Woolf's rhetorical, comic, and stylistic choices show traces of pro and anti-suffragette propaganda, from postcards to films. Because Woolf so deftly uses subversive appropriation in the story, I gave myself permission to shamelessly appropriate shots from anti-suffragette films, such as the misogynist Milling the Militants, 1913, in which a suffragette's husband has a dream fantasy of ways to punish the suffragettes, and A Lively Affair, 1912, in which errant women in which suffragettes are jailed by their husbands. I found it quite fulfilling to rescue these women from hostile films to transform them into the group of activist women in A Society. In Society, the perhaps naive, fearless Woolf is as yet unabashed. We can witness her free-ranging, uninhibited, wicked wit, Some of Woolf's comic interventions are drawn from performance and popular entertainment, such as the pantomime, the music hall, and early cinema. Some of Woolf's over-the-top slapstick bits in A Society could be music hall turns or bits from silent films, as when a vase of water is dumped on Helen during a scuffle, or Rose's rendition of the Dreadnought hoax, skewering the Navy and male honor. Castalia's cry, "Chastity, chastity, where's my chastity? Help, ho, the scent bottle," gestures to intertitle cards from silent film melodramas. A Society resonates with the madcap films of the comedians and fits in with the general hilarity of early silent comedies, including trick films. Many of these films, like The Story of Society, delight in visual tricks, cross-gender disguise, slapstick, and hyperbole. Let's dash through some of Woolf's continuum of comic strategies, from blatant, subtle political pokes at male privilege, from blatant to subtle political pokes at male privilege. In a move that drives the narrative of A Society, Woolf redirects male contempt for women, reversing their gaze, whereby men evaluate women to see if they are worthy of the vote, marriage, or whatever. In this story, women gaze back, judging men to decide if they are worthy of their privileged position or even of being reproduced. "Why," she asked, "if men write such rubbish as this, should our mothers have wasted their youth in bringing them into the world? But now that we can read, what prevents us from judging the results?" So we made ourselves into a society for asking questions. You can judge of our simplicity when I tell you that before parting that night, we agreed that the objects of life were to produce good people and good books. Our questions were to be directed to finding out how far these objects were now attained by men. In one hilarious inversion, Woolf has Castalia turn the tables on male arguments that women, girls, lose their charm and looks when they begin to cultivate their intellect, a common argument against education for women. Castalia mourns how cultivating their intellect ruins charming boys. What could be more charming than a boy before he has begun to cultivate his intellect? Then they teach him to cultivate his intellect. He becomes a barrister, a civil servant, etc., a professor. Soon he cannot come into a room without making us all feel uncomfortable. He condescends to every woman he meets and dares not tell the truth even to his own wife. Instead of rejoicing our eyes, we have to shut them if we are to take him into our arms. Woolf repurposes the anti-suffragette propaganda that shamed suffragettes as poor mothers and wives, propaganda that painted males as suffering male Madonnas having to care for the neglected children, as Castalia takes that propaganda point and turns it into a platform for saving the world. She argues that men must be made to have babies, or, quote, "we shall perish beneath the fruits of their unbridled activity." Woolf turns misogynist quotations against the authors when Cassandra, deadpan, paraphrases or quotes their phrases only to be countered by Castalia's rebuttals. "Surely you could teach her to believe that a man's intellect is, and always will be, fundamentally superior to a woman's," I suggested. "Oh, Cassandra, why do you torment me? Don't you know that our belief in man's intellect is the greatest fallacy of them all?" And then you have, oh my God, Judith's inventions. "Oh, bother," said Judith, who'd been inquiring into scientific matters. I'm not in love and I'm longing to explain my measures for dispensing with prostitutes and fertilizing virgins by act of parliament. She went on to tell us of an invention of hers to be erected at tube stations and other public resorts, which, upon payment of a small fee, would safeguard the nation's health, accommodate its sons, and relieve its daughters. Then she had contrived a method of preserving in sealed tubes the germs of future Lord Chancellors or poets or painters or musicians, she went on, supposing, that is to say, that these breeds are not extinct. And last but not least, Woolf uses collision montage editing, using juxtaposition for comic effect. Is Kensington a nice place to live in? Where is your son being educated? And your daughter? Now please tell me what you pay for your cigars. So which do you think would cost more, the cigars or the daughter's education? The juxtaposition here is brilliant. A society is a marvel of comedy and critique. It reaches far beyond its origin story, still resonating with new generations of activists who wink back at Woolf and applaud her delicious skewering of male privilege. Still relevant today, just over 100 years later, it is an exemplar of feminist comedy at its most satiric, powerful, and provocative. End note. Bennett and McCarthy, once powerful literary gatekeepers, are relative nobodies in 2022, at least so it seemed. But just a few weeks ago, a biography attempting to resurrect Arnold appeared by Patrick Donovan. The book was reviewed by Margaret Drabble, no less, than the TLS. I've read the book pre-release. Donovan does some thorough research on Bennett, his class background, and torturous upbringing. And the research actually reinforces the fact of Bennett's misogyny. However, any pretense of thorough scholarship drops away when Donovan brings in Virginia Woolf. Skimming the surface, ignoring all the research by Woolf scholars, and even omitting mention of this crucial text to society, Donovan decides Woolf is the villain in the piece when it comes to the clash between the two, most aggressively in his chapter entitled Woolf's Whipping Boy. Seriously? We are supposed to pity the poor misogynist victim of Woolf's wicked wit? But to end on a more positive note, I often wish Woolf had had a more supportive feminist coterie around her, akin to the one she imagined for us. Don't you? It is refreshing that Woolf in a Society was able to create an intelligent, vibrant camaraderie of women, embracing, laughing, and sharing, celebrating the delight of groups of women together. A Society is a revolutionary short story, a template for surviving in isolation. We can be grateful that she invented societies of women for us, at any rate, as we celebrate the moments of wild feminist humor she shared in A Society and Professions, and laugh out loud with her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. All right.
Now unshare. Oops.
Yes, I think you did manage to. That was
good.
Great. Thank you. All right, so I am going to put Diane Gillespie's the link to her presentation in the chat. So I believe that you all should have it. And so let me now introduce her. Diane Gillespie is Professor Emerita of English, Washington State University. She is author of The Sisters' Arts, The Writing and Painting of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on modern British women writers and painters. Gillespie is also editor of Woolf's Roger Fry for the Shakespeare Head Press and of the Multiple Muses of Virginia Woolf. She co-edited Julia Stevens' writings, a selected papers volume on Virginia Woolf and the arts, and Cicely Hamilton's play, Diana of Dobson's. In recent years, she has been looking at lesser-known Hogarth Press publications in relation to historical context and to Virginia Woolf's writing. This will be Diane's 25th Virginia Woolf conference paper. So welcome, Diane. I will share the screen with your presentation, and so give me 1 second. Okay, let me get it on my computer, and all right. So I will share a screen and get it up there and do slideshow. And so here we go. Can everyone see it? Okay, great. All right. Diane, does that look fine?
Yep, looks fine.
Great. Okay.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. And then Leslie, you just need to mute yourself.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Leslie is a hard act to follow, especially since I'm dealing with a society, although in a somewhat different way, less comedy, more ethics in a serious sense. Okay, Virginia Woolf's A Society, the Search, Societies, the Search, and the Pursuit of Good and True. The Hogarth Press published Virginia Woolf's Monday or Tuesday, including A Society, in 1921 with Vanessa Bell's cover. There it goes. Woolf's female characters, as we know, form a society for asking questions about the larger patriarchal society in which they live. Their rollicking mockeries and comic judgments have a serious side. They reflect and challenge discussions of words like good and true. Why won't that stay on?
Oh, okay. You want me just, Diane, if you could let me know when you want me to change it, that would be great.
No, I would rather change them.
Oh, well, then you would have to be the one who's putting it on.
Oh.
Yeah, otherwise, if you had it on, you could change it. And if not, I can stop sharing. You can share your screen if you like.
Oh, that'll just take up more time.
Oh, that's fine. We can do that. It won't take much time. Go ahead.
Oh, well, if I can figure out how to do it now.
That's fine. We have time.
Okay.
Or else you could just say next, Diane.
Yeah. And if you just say next, I can do it.
Okay. Well, now I have to get back to where I was.
Oh, Diane, I can do it. If you just say next, I'll just hit the next button.
Just relocating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
But I can't get back to
Your
Zoom
paper.
again. Yeah. Shoot.
The paper will
Sorry
come
about
back.
that.
Get rid of the. I've got my. There, I got rid of that. Now I see Vara.
So Diane, would you like me to share screen again then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, all right. And just say next whenever you want me to change it.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay. The comic judgments, or the serious side. They reflect and challenge discussions of words like good and true, first in masculine intellectual societies like those Virginia Woolf matured among, and second in publications with negative pronouncements about women's abilities. Her characters' questions validate, if not all their findings, at least their impulse to search for answers to ethical questions. When I belatedly decided to write another conference paper, I had been thinking about another Hogarth Press publication. 10 years after Monday or Tuesday in 1931, the press published 2 issues of a journal called The Search, authored by the Search Society. So we have 2 Hogarth Press publications and 2 societies seeking answers to questions about how to live in a rapidly changing, complex world. Conclusions keep escaping Woolf's young women in their loosely organized society. The men and women of the more formal Search Society also encountered and report on many variations of truth, but purposely avoid any overall conclusion. A society did not reappear in a Hogarth Press publication during Virginia Woolf's lifetime. As we well know, however, she experimented with other now famous ways to communicate more thoroughly the unethical nature and results of gender inequities. Neither did the press publish the search after the first two issues. And I have no time to say why. Virginia Woolf, busy writing The Waves and preparing for its publication, did not mention the journal in her published letters or diaries. Neither did Leonard Woolf, either in published letters or autobiography, but there are unpublished letters. Still, the Search Society is part of a cultural context for an ongoing study of Virginia Woolf and her own evolving quests for lived and aesthetic meaning in the 1920s and 30s. I have some restless searcher in me, she wrote in her diary in 1926. Why is there not a discovery in life, something one can lay one's hands on and say, this is it? Virginia Woolf may have parodied with anger and amusement definitions and applications of words like good and true, yet she did participate in ethical conversations, listen and read critically, revise, redefine, and make up her own mind. A society dramatizes, and the search encourages conversations about current social and ethical concerns. Next. Next.
Working on it.
Yeah, next. Is that what I'm supposed to do?
Yep.
Okay. Conversations are a theme in both Virginia Woolf's and Vanessa Bell's work. Among Bell's paintings before she illustrated A Society are 3 relaxed men conversing and 3 women talking more intimately in a soft, colorful environment. Next. Next.
Come on, Jeanne. You can do it. There we go.
Okay. Now the focus narrows to 3 women's heads and faces around a stack of books. This is how it all came about. Books are what prompt questions, merry meetings, and lively reports. Bold, simple black and white contrasts suggest conversations that, however amusing, voice serious, fundamentally subversive, Jane Marcus's words, social criticism. Woolf's A Society is as a hybrid literary creation, story, conversations, essay, possibly film. Since Woolf was 39 when she wrote it, she initially distances her present self from these very young speakers who meet for tea, admire milliners' shop windows, and begin, as usual, to praise men. Then Woolf awakens her characters to their unequal gender roles. Their loosely structured society investigates and shares findings about the degree to which men, with their education and power to contribute to the objects of life, produce good people and good books. If women have fulfilled their traditional role and populated the world, they ask, have men fulfilled theirs and civilized it? Have they discovered and lived according to what they claim to revere as good and true? Next. It is well established that Woolf's fictional society parodies ethical conversations like those of her brother's friends, members of the Cambridge Apostles or Conversation Society. They were, as Leonard Woolf recalls, devotees of G.E. Moore's passionate search for truth. Moore's attempt in Principia Ethica to determine what things are good in themselves, Leonard Woolf writes, answered their questions not with the religious voice of Jehovah or Jesus, but with the more divine voice of plain common sense. It is also clear that Desmond McCarthy, as affable hawk, as Leslie has shown us, used the word good in a way that provoked Virginia Woolf. When he agrees with Arnold Bennett's treatment of women as intellectually inferior to men, he treats the word good as part of a gendered hierarchy. If a small percentage of women's achievements are as good as men's, he says, still they fall short of the few men who are best of all. Good in this context means second or third rate. McCarthy, Woolf notes, seems unaware of some external restraint upon women's powers. In a society, she turns the evaluating finger back upon men's aesthetic and moral achievements in light of their unequal, unethical treatment of women. Next. Prompted by the conference theme, I noticed that the word good appears 18 times in the story. Truth or true appears 9 times. The repetition, varying in tone and meaning, suggests that men's reliance on ethical terms like these often was neither helpful nor valid. What happens when women do not just see them applied to their own restricted roles, but retaliate by applying them to privileged masculine institutions, aesthetic accomplishments, and moral behavior? Although meaning depends upon historic, geographic, and cultural variables, we still generally associate good with approved behavior and moral virtue, with high quality or satisfaction, with thoroughness or abundance, validity or sufficiency. We associate true with what is factual or real, faithful or reliable, honest or accurate. If the women in the story seem certain what they are looking for when they use these words, it is because, as Woolf later concludes, words do not live in dictionaries, they live in the mind. You know the story, so I'm only going to emphasize the words good and true. So in their investigations, the women cannot point to much in books that is of high quality aesthetically. Instead of good, quotations are the opposite: unutterably bad, execrable in style, rubbish, verbose, sentimental foolery, or when applied to Royal Academy pictures, gibberish. Nor can the women point to behavior that is morally virtuous. They laugh at the Navy's version of the word honor and the Oxbridge professor's defense of Sappho's chastity. A good man must be honest, passionate, and unworldly. And a scholarly man should be, I assume in addition, overflowing with humor and invention, a delightful companion, generous, subtle, imaginative. Not having found good men in business law, or other professions either, the women re-emphasize trying to find out whether they are justified in continuing the human race. When it comes to the word civilization, the women admit it has its marvels, including airplanes, the telegraph, studies of the atom and the universe. Countering these are statistics about the poor, working conditions, business and finance, the government, the British colonies. They despair of reaching any conclusion, since civilization is so much more complex than we had any notion. They return to their original search for the object of life and a good man. Again, they are frustrated, since very few men would reply at all or seriously to questions about morality and religion, or about the value of money and power. As for literature, do popular male novelists, the women ask, write good books? Do they tell the truth? If truth has nothing to do with literature, then the discussion seemed very inconclusive. At the end of the Great War, the women affirm yet again their definitions of the object of life and a good man. But they note women's reward for encouraging men to develop their intellects is to be treated with condescension and evasions of truth. Men's unbridled activity results in wars that endanger everyone, certainly the opposite of good behavior. The only good once a younger girl learns to read, they conclude, is to teach her to believe in herself and carry on as president of the Society of the Future. In 1937, Virginia Woolf declared in Craftsmanship that although words are the only things that tell the truth, it is in their nature to change, because the truth they try to catch is many-sided, and they convey it by being themselves many-sided. Individuals and generations define them differently. The implication for a society is that words like good and true could not mean the same things to Woolf's young women and to the men and institutions they try to investigate. In Woolf's A Society, women cannot get answers to their questions, and much seems inconclusive. The Search Society is part of a larger context. Next slide. Okay. The journal's editors were men, E.J. Langford Garston, whose interests were spiritual alchemy and the occult, and Hugh J. Schoenfield, a liberal Hebrew Christian and pacifist. It was Leonard Woolf who proposed to Mr. Schoenfield that the Hogarth Press publish the journal. His curiosity was aroused perhaps by the editor's background, plus the journal's planned essays and reviews in several branches of modern scholarship, religion, philosophy, science, literature, and art. Virginia Woolf shared these interests, including religion. Her search for images and words for her own transcendent moments and her knowledge of religions, mysticism, and spirituality are subjects of considerable scholarly commentary. Could I have the next one? Thank you. The Search Society made a virtue of not trying to agree about what is true. Life today is so complex, so multifarious in its interests and activities, that it is exceedingly difficult for the average individual to keep pace with the progress of thought and discovery in the domains of religion, philosophy, science, literature, and art. Still more, to hold a philosophy that will harmonize the conflict of opinions. Truth has indeed so many aspects as to appear bewildering, if not undiscoverable. There is a vital need, therefore, for an impartial periodical which will present its readers in a form as readily assimilable as possible with the researches and conclusions of modern scholarship as advanced by the chief exponents of the various branches of knowledge. Such is the purpose of the search. Of necessity, no attempt can be made to coordinate the facts and theories put forward, nor is it presumed would the thoughtful student appreciate any such endeavor. Okay, Search Society members were both male and female. They did not have to infiltrate institutions or professions to do their research because most of them had background already. Some were degree holders, some were reviewers and common readers, some were novelists and poets. All I can do today is give you a sense of the search by mentioning 3 examples of essays from the first 2 issues. All 3 look for truth in different ways and in different fields. I have the next one. Okay. Margaret Legg was a feminist novelist who wrote about creative religion. She thinks professional institutionalized religion and the material side of modern life have caused people to lose sight of the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. Therefore, even ancient truths must take new forms. These she finds in supreme works of art. A will to expression gives a person the quality of a supreme work of art and makes life a work of art, perfect self-expression. Virginia Woolf furthered this philosophy in A Sketch of the Past. As we know, the whole world is a work of art. We are parts of the work of art. We are the words. We are the music. We are the thing itself. I have the next one. Okay. The first issue also includes a lively defense of British composer Joseph Holbrook and a plea for true criticism, focused on quality and quantity of the music of a genius, not on his abrasive personality. Andy Dagg, music critic, admits that Holbrook was a controversial composer who aggressively attacked any critics and musical organizations that neglected his work. Whether or not Virginia Woolf knew Holbrook's work, she did love music, as Emma Sutton, Adriana Varga, and quite a few others show. She also knew one outspoken composer, Ethel Smythe. Then, as Woolf's 1939 pamphlet on reviewing indicates, she was aware of hurtful effects on literary writers of sometimes petty reviews, as opposed to constructive criticism. Could I have the next one? Okay, my last example is of scientific truth, and it's from both issues of the search. In the first issue, M. Proctor Gregg, who was an expert and reviewer of books on modern air transport and commerce, had written an enthusiastic review of the scientific reality described in The Mysterious Universe by Sir James Jeans. We know through the work of Holly Henry and others that this book influenced Virginia Woolf and her writing. Already in a society the women acknowledge among the marvels of civilization, that man embraces the universe in his speculations. To the second issue of the search, M. Proctor Gregg contributed an equally enthusiastic illustrated essay called The Planetarium, for which I thank Eleanor, who found it for me in the British Library in London. The present astronomical conflict, he declares metaphorically, makes science a new religion, provides matter for the newest testament, whether it be the gospel according to St. Jean's or an epistle from Eddington. He calls the modern planetarium the nth wonder of the world. Proctor Gregg goes on to describe the futuristic temple or dome, its mythical machinery, and the almost religious effects of its high priest's ministrations. So we have three examples, three versions of the truth in religion, music criticism, and science. Can I have the next one? Woolf, who calls herself a restless searcher, and the Search Society both continue to ask questions about life's meanings. Both discussed and recast ethical, philosophical, religious, and aesthetic words and traditions in non-traditional ways. I conclude appropriately with questions. Are co-educational societies like ours, founded in Woolf's name, among those of the future envisioned at the end of a society? Are Virginia Woolf's literary and personal writings another newer testament, a collection of ethical parables relevant for our lives today? That's it.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
Technical abilities.
Well, we figured it out.
Yeah.
All right. Our third and final, Eleanor, would you like to share your screen, or should we try?
I'm gonna try. I mean, I'll see.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Okay. All right. And I'll post your paper in a second. So I'll
Okay.
introduce you and then I'll post the link to your paper.
Yeah.
Eleanor McNees is just about to become Professor Emerita after 35 years in the Department of English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver. Congratulations. She works on Virginia Woolf and her Victorian predecessors, especially her father, Leslie Stephen, and her uncle, James Fitzjames Stephen. In addition to publishing essays and book chapters on Dickens, Hopkins, Arnold, and others, she annotated the Harcourt edition of The Years and has 3 other edited collections: Sources and Documents of the Novel, 3 volumes, the Brontes Critical Assessments, 4 volumes, and Virginia Woolf Critical Assessments, also 4 volumes. She is completing a monograph through Stephen I's Virginia Woolf on the Victorians, in which she assesses the impact of Leslie and Fitzjames Stephen on Virginia Woolf's essays. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Tell me if you can see this. Let's see here.
Yeah.
Is that working?
Yep.
Amazing. Okay, thanks. Thank you. So I'm calling this Ethics in the Biographical Essayist, Leslie Stephen and Virginia Woolf.
Take it off presentation,
Okay, let's see here.
then we would have a big.
I have 2 screens, which I should never have. Let's see here.
What we see now is the presentation version, which is your
Okay.
slide, the next slide, and every slide in the presentation.
Let me just see here. Let me try this.
But be careful because of what happened last year.
Oh my gosh, I'll never get over that. So, and I've even practiced this. Okay,
That's
maybe
the
I'd
button.
have Jeannie.
It's
maybe I-
okay.
No, on Eleanor, click that. Yeah, use slideshow.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Well, let's just hope I can shift to other slides and I don't have, those things that went across my presentation the entire last year. Anyhow, in a 1906 review of lectures and essays by Canon Ainger, a Cambridge friend of Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf stresses a key difference between Victorian and modern writers, whether critics, reviewers, or biographers. But the distinction of writers of the 19th century, she says, seems to be that the ideas which interested them were ethical rather than aesthetic. Woolf further notes of Ainger and his contemporaries, and clearly here she is referring to her father's biographical practice too, that since they assumed an implicit identity between the writer and the work, they tended to dwell on the ethical element more strenuously than on the intellectual or the aesthetic. But here, Woolf turns the tables on Ainger and purposely applies his method to Ainger himself. She detects and expands upon, quote, the element in his work which reveals his character, end quote. She concludes the short review with a summary of Ainger's own character as drawn from his lectures and essays. Though she disagrees with Ainger's insistence on that moral element, and here she conflates, as she does elsewhere, morality with ethics. She asserts that, quote, the picture of the man himself is the best thing in these volumes. All will agree that he possessed a mind of singular culture and sincerity, and that his sympathy was with everything, both in life and letters, that he held to be sweet and true, end quote. Woolf quotes Ainger's own definition of the moral element as synonymous with, quote, the human element, the ear that hears the still, sad music of humanity and responds to it, end quote. And here one finds a triadic resonance that connects Woolf, Ainger, and Leslie Stephen in the echo from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, lines that will set an explicitly ethical standard for Ainger and Stephen, and an implicit one for Woolf's estimate of character in her biographical essays. Although she hesitated to follow, this doesn't quite, this, you can wait with this slide, it doesn't matter, I'll wait. Although she hesitated to follow her father in what Noel Annan and others have termed Stephen's evolutionary ethics, and though she often parodied adherence to a moral code Stephen defined in his book, The Science of Essays, written in 1882, as, quote, that set of rules which is respected in a given society and becomes an effective force in governing conduct, Woolf nevertheless adapted Stephen's ethical investigation of character in her biographical essays. In their insistence on empathic identification with their subjects as a prerequisite for evaluating both writer and work, Stephen and Woolf invite readers to adopt a similarly ethical approach, to avoid judgment before thoroughly acquainting themselves with the subject. Father and daughter differ mainly in the traits and biographical anecdotes they choose to emphasize, and in the discursive techniques they employ to convey what Stephen terms soul and Woolf spirit of their biographical subjects. In what follows, I use the test cases of Stephen's and Woolf's reviews of and essays on both William and Dorothy Wordsworth to suggest Woolf's indebtedness to Stephen's ethical biographical method. Along the way, I digress briefly into the ethical debates waged by members of the Metaphysical Society in the latter third of the 19th century, as well as Leslie Stephen's response to both Henry Sidgwick's and Thomas Huxley's works on ethics. All three, in addition to Leslie Stephen's brother, James Fitzjames, were members of the Metaphysical Society. Among the principal topics which the theologians, scientists, and free thinkers of the society discussed, questions of ethics and ethical behavior assumed high priority. Though I won't have time to pursue Woolf's participation in the Memoir Club of the 1930s, a comparison of both groups might reflect the shift from a widely participatory late Victorian debate about ethics to a post-World War I emphasis on insulated and isolated individualism. And S.P. Rosenbaum, perhaps the most perspicacious of scholars to perceive connections between Bloomsbury and the Victorian era of Leslie Stephen, acknowledges the emphasis of Leslie Stephen's Dictionary of National Biography on Bloomsbury biographies, and especially on Woolf and Forster. The primary difference between the two generations of biographers, Rosenbaum states, is the absence of moral purpose in the Bloomsbury biographies. Of Stephen's DNB articles, Rosenbaum notes a preference for a moral as opposed to aesthetic analysis, and in the longer biographies, a tendency to assert a moral purpose for the reader's edification. Both Bloomsbury biographers and Leslie Stephen, however, still struggled with a reticence that arguably amounted to an ethical choice not to pry inappropriately into the biographical subject's intimate life or imaginatively to speculate on motivations and events. Only by fictionalizing biography in Flesh and Orlando could Woolf cast off these restraints and allow imagination and suggestion free play. Arguing ironically that, quote, the capacity for a sort of moral negative capability was never one of Stephen's strong points, Todd Avery extends Rosenbaum's comparison of Bloomsbury's modes of artistic engagement to focus primarily on this distinction between what he perceives as Stephen's conservative morality and Bloomsbury's ethical aestheticism. Following Deleuze's categorical distinction between morality and ethics, Avery argues for Bloomsbury's ethical rejection of morality as a category of assessment and judgment. He adduces Walter Pater's famously controversial 1876 conclusion to studies in the history of the Renaissance as the key break from a Victorian hierarchical and static moral code. In his insistence, however, on Stephen's conservatism, Avery neglects a career-long attempt to interrogate the foundation of moral conduct, and finally to ground morality in an ethics of social and familial responsibility. In addition to scholars who discuss the burgeoning field of feminist narrative ethics, Melba Cuddy-Keene addresses the modernist problem of determining ethical writing and reading practices in a world without absolutes, where one faces alternative ethical systems which preclude any deontological or externally imposed code of ethics. Cuddy-Keene takes the question of narrative ethics a step further to include the reader, who is asked to perform an ethical reading in response to the representation of ethical choices a character makes in the text. This ethical reading, however, is more ambiguous and ethically fraught than the distinct moral purpose of the Victorian biography. The reader's choice of the correct ethical conduct is not dictated by any external rule, but rather by a back and forth juggling of possible alternatives, an act that requires a kind of negative capability. While modernist scholars seek to chart the rupture between Victorian and modern conceptions of morality and ethics, it's particularly useful, I think, to cast a glance backward to the initial debates following Darwin's evolutionary theories. The world into which Leslie Stephen and his compatriots were abruptly thrust by Darwin's 1859 Origin of Species and his 1870 Descent of Man arguably caused a greater rift than that between Victorian and modern generations. The discussion of members of the Metaphysical Society, founded by a group of university-educated editors, religious figures, and scientists, and initially including poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, continually staged debates about the sources and validity of ethical belief and conduct in monthly meetings over the course of 11 years. Roughly split between the empirical utilitarians and the Intuitionists, members of the two camps sought largely in vain to convert their opponents to their side. And I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to insert something I didn't know until today, really. I really think one could argue possibly, and Diane and Leslie, you can bring in later on, that in some ways, Woolf could also be parodying in the society, Metaphysical Society. I don't know, that's just a suggestion. So I'm skipping that. So Leslie Stephen joined the society in 1877. His brother James Fitzjames was already an actively pugnacious member toward the end of its existence and presented only 2 papers over his 4-year tenure, Belief and Evidence in 1877 and Uniformity of Nature in 1879. Both papers represented Stephen's affiliation with the empiricists and his clear rejection of intuitionist reasoning. In the first paper, Stephen was responding to Roman Catholic Cardinal Newman's Grammar of Assent, in which Newman argued for belief based on intuition and probability. Always searching for a rational, evidence-based ground, for any system of belief. Stephen considered belief based on enthusiasm and persuasion a blind contagion. And he goes on to fault Newman for collecting too many people behind this movement. So I'm going to skip just a little bit. Outside the Metaphysical Society, Stephen engaged in debates about ethics with fellow philosophers and scientists, particularly with his friend and antagonist Henry Sidgwick, in a long 1875 review of Sidgwick's Methods of Ethics, published in Fraser's Magazine, and nearly 2 decades later, in a response to Huxley, Ethics and the Struggle for Existence, which Stephen published in the Contemporary Review. In the former, Stephen takes Sidgwick to task for failing to state his position clearly and for not grounding his philosophy in concrete evidence. He charges Sidgwick with having a too purely metaphysical approach. Stephen's response to Huxley's idea that one's ethical nature is constantly battling hostile cosmic forces that threaten to overwhelm and obliterate humankind takes a different tack from his critique of Sidgwick, acknowledging that the origin of morality begins with the capacity for sympathy. Stephen still sees a congruence between morality and the struggle for existence. He follows the utilitarian philosophy here in suggesting that moral duty consists in acting for the greater good of one's society. And he advocates a kind of evolutionary sense of duty which each man owes to society at large. For both Stephen and Woolf, the act of writing a biography must necessarily entail learning to feel for the subject, and in turn making the reader feel for the subject. In his Ethical Biographical Manifesto of 1893, Biography, published in the National Review, Stephen issues an ethical challenge to the biographer, one Woolf will echo in her modernist manifestos, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, and Modern Fiction nearly 3 decades later. Ingeniously employing a metaphor from a newly invented device, the telephone, Stephen sketches the biographer's ideal role. A biographer has, of course, he says, to lay down the framework, to settle all the dates and the skeleton of facts. But to breathe real life into it, he must put us into direct communication with the man himself, not tell us simply where he was or what he was seen to do, but put him at one end of a literary telephone and the reader at another. The author should, as often as possible, be merely the conducting wire. Stephen concludes that the biographer's aim should be to present the human soul, not all its irrelevant bodily trappings, an injunction Woolf deftly illustrates in her emphasis on Mrs. Brown's spirit and not on the external details of materialist Edwardian novelists. And Stephen, as Woolf will do later, especially in her reviews of biographies and memoirs, insists that to offer the reader, quote, a speaking likeness of the subject, the biographer should allow the subject to speak through letters and diaries if possible, and not behind a heavy-handed narrative voice. In spite, or perhaps because of his attempt to ground moral principles in an evidence-based science, Leslie Stephen made an exception for Wordsworth, who was clearly more closely aligned with the intuitionist or transcendental school than the empirical scientific one. In 3 pieces from an 1876 essay, Wordsworth's Ethics, about which there was a paper this morning, actually, to an extended review of a book on Wordsworth's youth, La Jeunesse de Wordsworth, The Early Life of William Wordsworth in 1897, to a long biographical account after he was no longer editor in the Dictionary of National Biography in 1900, Stephen seeks to uncover the essence of Wordsworth's character, charting the milestones in his relationships with nature and people. He unearths the character, philosopher, and poet largely from the poems and letters, and ultimately concludes that despite charges of egotism and increasing conservatism, Wordsworth remained true to his own nature, and ironically, perhaps closer to Sidgwick's metaphysical basis of conduct than to Stephen's own. In Wordsworth's Ethics, Stephen asks, what is the nature of man and the world in which he lives, and what, in consequence, should be our conduct? Probing Wordsworth's poetry, Stephen finds a remarkable blend of the philosopher who is able to reason logically and the poet who imaginatively transforms ordinary incidents into poetry. The difference between the two, according to Stephen, is that the poet has intuitions while the philosopher gives demonstrations, that the thought which in one mind is converted into emotion is in the other resolved into logic, and that a symbolic representation of the idea is substituted for a direct expression. Significantly, Stephen, like John Stuart Mill before him, found consolation from grief in Wordsworth's poetry, an autobiographical detail that causes him momentarily to deviate from his ethical biographical code of allowing the subject to speak in his own voice. Recognizing more the lesson Wordsworth has taught him than reproducing Wordsworth's own words, Stephen states, "The man who has learnt habitually to think of himself as part of a greater whole, whose conduct has been habitually dedicated to noble ends, is purified and strengthened by the spiritual convulsion." As a moral poet, Wordsworth is able to convey a moral lesson, but Stephen suddenly chastises himself for, quote, preaching in the place of Wordsworth, end quote, and proceeds to substitute Wordsworth's persona's voice in The Happy Warrior for that of Stephen himself. And I'm going to skip, because of time, my brief discussion of Stephen's review of Wordsworth's youth and also his biographical entry in the Dictionary of Biography, which you can read in the DNB, the old archived entry, and go on to Woolf, just because of time. I always do this. I never learned to write a paper in 20 minutes even. Woolf and the Wordsworths. Virginia Woolf wrote a review of a new edition of Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes for TLS in 1906, and another review of a 3-volume collection of Wordsworth's letters, again for TLS in 1908. In 1929, she wrote, as part of a 4-part series on 18th century figures, a short essay on Dorothy Wordsworth, though William certainly figured in the sketch as well. Taken together, these 3 pieces illustrate what I'll call Woolf's ethical biographical method, though unlike essays by her father, they do not mention either morality or ethics. She does, however, practice, as she had in her reviews of Ainger's essays, a certain camaraderie with her subject, one that allows her to express aspects of character as if the subject were speaking. Like Stephen, she too toils with the ethical question of how best to render a biographical subject. If morality has become a slanderous word by the 20th century, Woolf subtly insinuates a moral verdict as she explores her subject's most characteristic traits. Like Stephen, she pushes the subject to speak for itself through quoted passages that place the reader, viewer in direct communication with the subject. In the review of Guide to the Lake, she herself acts as a guide for the reader of passages she finds most revelatory of Wordsworth's character. Like Stephen, she chooses specific passages she feels best exemplify the subject's essence, and in doing so, she indicates through quotation and commentary what comprises that essence. After, for example, quoting the profoundly metaphysical passage in which Wordsworth appears to access recesses of feeling otherwise impenetrable, Woolf assumes the role of translator. I'm sorry. And I'm not going to read this. This is just her sort of ventriloquizing and then commenting on Wordsworth's descriptive passages. Both Woolf and Stephen perceive and appreciate, even though they cannot share, Wordsworth's ability to move from observation of natural phenomena toward a transcendent and life-sustaining personal meaning. The sincerity and solemnity with which Wordsworth approaches nature comprise an ethical quest. And this quest for Stephen implies a solid sense of morality. Woolf would, in keeping with the modernist disjunction between ethics and morality, perceive the ethical nature of the quest, though she would not claim that the quest indicates a writer's moral sensibility. I go on to mention her brief review of Wordsworth's letters, in which she does much the same thing about allowing those to quote Wordsworth himself. And then 10 years later, in her 1929 essay on Dorothy Wordsworth, revised from its initial publication in The Nation and Athenaeum and the New York Herald Tribune for the Second Common Reader, Woolf finds the same attention and openness to each small natural detail in Dorothy. Culling examples from Dorothy's journals, as she had from Wordsworth's letters, she suggests that this same minute observation of nature inhabits Dorothy's prose as it had Wordsworth's description of the lakes. Quoting from the journal, she focuses this time on the transformative effect Dorothy's sometimes cryptic descriptions have on the reader. And this is a quotation from the Dorothy Wordsworth essay. More than Stephen, Woolf focuses on the way both William and Dorothy Wordsworth encourage the reader to move from the concrete to the metaphysical. But Woolf also, as both Rayner and Altes in their discussion of feminist ethics assert, dwells more than Stephen on the triadic and reciprocal relationship between William and Dorothy and nature, as well as between writer and reader. Not for William or Dorothy, Coleridge's despairing line in Dejection and Ode, "O lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live." In his essay on biography, Leslie Stephen argues that the best biographies should aim to indicate a revelation and, as much as possible, the self-revelation of a character. This aim, for Stephen and for Woolf, constitutes the keystone of an ethical biographer, who, ideally for Stephen at least, and certainly in the case of Wordsworth, chooses a subject whose self-revelation sets a moral standard for the reader. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, everybody. That was fantastic. So we have about 6 minutes for questions. And so why don't we open up the floor?
So Pat Lawrence has posted a comment, but we can pause and think. I don't know, Pat, if you want us to talk about that. Okay.
Looks like Pat might not be here, but it looks like Elisa has her hand up.
I responded really intensely to the humor in Leslie's presentation. And I was cracking up, and it reminded me, I'm rereading The Waves with Catherine Paul, and I'm just rereading chapter 3. And I cannot believe how hysterically funny Bernard is. I mean, it's exactly the same parodic pose as you see in a society. And, you know, he's walking around trying to invent who he is, and he thinks he's really Byronic. And it's so hard, I think, a lot of the times to, when you read Woolf, to let yourself go enough to realize that she is out loud laugh funny. And so I would add to what Pat just said, you know, the way that Bernard is treated in The Waves is oftentimes really, really ludicrous if you got your mind clicked to recognize that and to not take him seriously. So thank you for that. It's lovely to be reminded how funny she is.
Well, you know, it's so many decades of criticism kind of turned her into a humorless figure, and the Hours film, if finished it off. But there is that so much of the sense in a society of eye-rolling humor. And when Cassandra, who ordinarily would be the one who prophesizes and people don't believe her, but instead she's clueless herself. I mean, some of those images and figures and speeches are hilarious when you actually focus on them. So.
Yeah, can I myself comment? I like the range from kind of humor to moral earnestness and seriousness. Eleanor, I was thinking how yours was kind of a nice bookend to Leslie's, and I like the way, Diane, yours is sort of in the middle, but I think about A Room of One's Own as a kind of self-help book. And of course, Woolf would have really abjured self-help books because of their kind of earnest tone. And yet you sort of show that she can't kind of altogether show that she's not a daughter of Leslie Stephen and the Victorians. And I just think that you showed that very well, even if she's not going to use the same language. And I have to agree with you, Elisa and Leslie, that yeah, I have a hard time picking up so many of her essays without seeing humor. I mean, whether she's writing travel essays or exploiting kind of the humorous encounters that take place in travel. So anyway, I just thought the panel was really well designed.
I might just say though, originally we went back and forth on some of the society ideas, and I didn't think at all that I was going to touch any society until I discovered this Metaphysical Society, and then plunged into that. At the same time, I found some of the search things, and then I couldn't stop, and so it was just, it's crazy how the rabbit holes you go down. But I love the humor too, and I'm not a very humorous person, and so I appreciate this.
And then Diane, I just want to thank you for highlighting the word good. I never really paid attention to it. And now suddenly I'm going to go back and even relook at Flush. I won't have time before my paper, but thank you for that.
One thing about the comedy in Woolf is that you have to kind of slow down to get the nuances. And so many of the editions we have of a Monday or Tuesday or whatever don't give you that space, which is one reason I did my edition, because you get a line on a page or two and then it sinks in. You get it, you really get the full flavor of the humor. So
Listening to Woolf on audio books has been a revelation. And it's because the audiobooks are so much slower than my reading. So I think you're totally right that slower process of reading can alert you to how firmly her tongue is in her cheek.
I wanted to add to Eleanor's paper that when Woolf does the Roger Fry biography, she does let him speak for himself so frequently and was criticized for that. Like she was sort of abnegating her role and just taking the easy way out by quoting him a lot. It's an interesting background for the Roger Fry biography. I can add a couple of things about the search that I couldn't fit in my paper.
Oh, do. I found that so fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's another society, and it is very rigidly organized. It has both men and women in it, but they have to apply for membership, and they had weekly lectures. A lot of the lectures, well, some of the lectures then ended up in the search journal, but not all of them, because that journal had a lot of book reviews in it. And that was probably one of the best things about it, was reviewing all the books that had just come out. But it was a very, very organized, highly organized society. They had their own library where people could go and get books that were relevant. And just in connection with Leslie's paper, there was a woman who wrote poetry for the search, an occult poetess, poet, whose name was Ethel Archer, but her nickname was Sappho. So anyway, there's all these funny little loose ends, and I had a terrible time not only accessing the search, because in this country, there aren't a lot of copies. There were copies at the University of Delaware, and they just sent me the whole first issue in an email. And then from HRHRC, I was trying to get the second issue, and they said it was in copyright. So they only sent me one essay out of it. And then Eleanor was able to, when she was in the British Library, copy a couple of things for me and email them to me. And I contacted the guy at York Harbor Books. He says he's been searching for the search for a long time. And our library is searching for it too. And they can't get a copy of it. So British Library, of course, would be the the way to find it, because they obviously have probably all of the issues of the search. But anyway, it was an interesting thing. And a lot of the people who were writing for it and mentioned in it, I couldn't find anything about. Like N.V. Dagg, who wrote that music criticism, couldn't find out anything about him. He wrote another little article on who wrote the Marseillaise, but that was the only other thing I could find out about him. And
You referred to Margaret Legg, who wrote A Semi-Detached Marriage. Did you find out anything more about her?
I was looking, I found the thing
Yeah.
I quoted, and there's a big edition of feminist literature. I've got it on my shelf. That has a little bit of a biography of her. I couldn't find a picture. I wanted a picture to put in there, but I couldn't. And I think if you do a search online, you can find that she's mentioned in other people's studies of novels of that period. But she doesn't get a lot of attention. But that novel, if you search for that novel, A Semi-Detached Marriage, then some things come up about her. And then images, and they're all of wedding ceremonies that have nothing to do with her at all. I mean, I get so frustrated trying to find things online, but anyway, it's been a project, and I don't know how much longer I'll pursue it. I need the religious part of it for something else I'm working on.
Anne-Marie has posted a question. How did Leonard get in touch with the search people, and why?
Oh, I don't know how he got in touch with them. I don't know. That I have the correspondence from Reading, thanks to Helen Southworth, who shared that with me. And there's a lot of correspondence that goes back and forth. And this was very cordial to start with, very, very appreciative and collaborative. But then tensions arose over circulation and finances, expenses, and then the records that search people were keeping and Hogarth Press were keeping did not agree. And then the tones of the letters deteriorated. And finally, John Lehman came on board and wrote the letter that ended the collaborative agreement. But I don't know how they met in the first place, but the fact that Schoenfield was a Christian Jew might have interested Leonard, a Hebrew Christian, whatever. And a lot of what he wrote was about that issue. He wrote a lot. You can find him online.
Well, thank you. Great.
Can I just say, in response to Elisa's question, I wonder if Margaret Legg was influenced by Emily Eden, who lived from around 1797 through around 1860 something, who wrote two novels called The Semi-Detached House and The Semi-Detached Couple. And so anyway, and then Emily Eden was an aunt of Violet Dickinson, and it was Violet Dickinson who asked Woolf to write a review of a new collection of letters that had come out by Emily Eden, and she's very, very funny, speaking of funny. So.
Yeah. Well, there's a more contemporary woman writer who has written something called The Semi-Detached Marriage, I believe, because that comes up when you search. So,
it seems that Pat Lawrence has returned.
Did you want, Pat, did you want to say something about your post on the chat?
Oh, there she is.
For a moment. Hi, you're muted.
Let's see. I can't see what I wrote in the chat because my connection problem erased my chats. Somewhat, perhaps someone else could read it.
I can post it for you. It's there for everyone to see right now, including you.
I just wanted to thank Leslie and Diane because they always have such lively and imaginative presentations, and wanted to suggest that the issue of amusement and skepticism and gaiety continues in Woolf's writing in Three Guineas, and she says that in that work, laughter is an antidote to dominance, not only of men in the household, but Mussolini, Hitler, if you were a dictator, and that Leonard picks up on that also. And I just happen to know about it because I wrote about that for Wayne Chapman and Manson's anthology on writing couples. So I wondered if you are continuing your exploration of humor and laughter and critique into the later works.
I'm not sure whether I'll be continuing what I'm doing, but unless I might be doing Jacob's Room with the film context, which would be similar. But it feels to me that Woolf has a kind of a lifelong engagement with how comedy can work that changes dramatically from the kind of raucous free form one to the more restrained room of one's own, and that she is always negotiating with that. And I haven't had a chance to really go through all of that, but I think it would be a fascinating study just to think of. I'd like to go through the letters in the diary and look more at. I know that she was very upset when the friendship with Desmond kind of cooled because of this. But she wrote in her, I guess it was diary, that she felt badly that the friendship had suffered, but she had to say what she had to say. So that whole tension between the politics and the friendship and comedy would be an interesting thing to go further into. Her group, those guys were not very supportive of her feminism. And I think that's a little tragedy to me.
Leslie, it strikes me too. I've been thinking about Woolf's satirical, how she seems to me, and I may be wrong, but to become more and more satirical. And that's a wonderful weapon. And of course, a weapon used constantly in the 18th century. And of course, that was, I can't stop talking about Leslie Stephen. I won't go on it, but he was very much interested in the 18th century. That was his century. His major work was writing about people in that period. And I just am curious about this difference between, comedy and humor that she uses, and much more biting satire. The satire seems to be very pointed towards, more specific people. I'm not sure. I'm still trying to work that out.
Well, it's tricky too, because I think when she makes those comments about, how women have benefited from the juvenile satire and so forth, she's obviously tongue in cheek there. But a lot of the talks we've listened to so far today, the question of ethics and comedy as a weapon, even though I was saying self-defense, I really think she was groping towards something in places that would be not just weapon-like, but not just conciliatory, but that would move and transform the people that she is trying to reach, as well as the choir of feminists or whatever. So I think it wasn't an easy quest. There's not an easy way for women to have humor about these kinds of social issues.
Thank you so much. It looks like we need to close now, and we can keep talking at the well, I don't know how that will work, but during the social hour. So thank you all for a fabulous panel. Thank you, audience. So we will regroup, I think, later. And I look forward to seeing you in future panels. All right, thanks again.
And in person.
Bye.
Bye.
Congrats.